One of the interesting things about the Bible is we get lots of little snapshots on people's lives, but there are not very many people that we get very much information about, except for a handful of people. You could say we kind of know a fair amount about Abraham. We know a fair amount about Joseph. We know a fair amount about Moses. We know a fair amount about David. We know a fair amount about Jesus. We know a fair amount about Peter and Paul. And then after that, most people we just get like little snippets of, right? And so sometimes when we can sink our teeth into a story about one of those guys, it's kind of great because you get a fuller context. Well, tonight I want to look at a story from the life of David. Now, I'm just going to read, starting in verse 21, I'm going to read verse 1 through 9, and then we're going to work our way through it. Then David came to Nob to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech came trembling to meet David and said to him, "Why are you alone and no one with you?" David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has commissioned me with a matter and has said to me, 'Let no one know anything about the matter on which I am sending you and which I have commissioned you, and I have directed the young men to a certain place. Now, therefore, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever can be found.' The priest answered David and said, 'There is no ordinary bread on hand, but there is the consecrated bread. If only the young men have kept themselves from women.' David answered the priest and said to him, 'Surely women have been kept from us as previously when I set out, and the vessels of the young men were holy, though it was an ordinary journey. How much more than today will the vessels be holy?' So the priest gave him consecrated bread, for there was no bread there but the bread of the presence, which was removed from before the Lord, in order to put hot bread in its place when it was taken away. Now one of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg the Edomite, and the chief of Saul's shepherds. David said to Ahimelech, 'Now is there not a spear or a sword on hand? For I brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's matter was urgent.' When the priest said, 'The sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, behold, it is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you would take it for yourself, take it, for there is no other except it here.' And David said, 'There is none like it, give it to me.'" Lord, we pray, God, as we get into your word tonight, Jesus, that you would help us, God, to internalize your truth, God. That your life-giving word, God, would go into our hearts and minds, Father, and would produce good fruit, Father. You would do a work in us tonight, God. We'd submit ourselves to you, God, and that, Lord, you would teach us and your spirit would train us. In Jesus' holy name. All people said? Amen, amen. I want to kind of give a background to what's going on here. And first I want to say this is at a point in David's life that marks something of a transition, okay? And there have been 2 other major events in David's life before this that help us understand how we came here today. When David was between 10 and 15, we don't know the exact number, but he was right in that age range. The prophet Samuel came to his hometown and came and found the God told him, "I want you to go to the house of Jesse, and I'm going to have you anoint the next king over Israel." Remember, Saul was the first king of Israel, that he had been chosen by the people because he was a man, tall in stature, head and shoulders above everybody else, handsome, good-looking, smart, all that kind of stuff. They chose him to be his king. He sinned against the Lord and displeased God, and so God said, "I'm going to raise up another king." And so he sends Samuel to the town of Bethlehem, to the house of Jesse, in order to anoint the next king. He says, "Jesse, I want you to bring out all your sons." Jesse brings out 7 of his sons. The first one, Samuel thinks, this has got to be it. This guy's great. He looks strong. He looks like he'd make a great king. God said, "No. While man looks at the outer appearance, God looks at the heart." He goes through all 7 of his sons, and God says, "No, no, 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 no," to Samuel. Finally, Samuel says to Jesse, the father, he says, "Is this everybody?" He said, "Well, I have one other son." This makes you think he was closer to 10 than 15. And he says, "Bring him here." He's out in the field tending sheep. He brings David to him. The Lord says, "This is the one in whom I have chosen." The people chose Saul, but I have chosen David. So there's David, probably 10, 11, 12 years old, and the prophet of Israel comes, and he anoints him with oil on his head in front of everybody and says, "You are God's chosen one to be the next king over Israel." Okay, what's radical is that then he leaves and nothing happens, right? So I don't know what you would have been like at 11 years old, where somebody comes and says, like somebody who knows what they're talking about says, "You are going to be the next king of the universe, president of the United States of America, whatever, emperor, whatever it is," right? And David's family's poor. They're subsistence living shepherds. They live in the place. So David gets chosen. Now, there's a little bit of a comparison if you think back to when Joseph had those dreams, right? Where the stars were bowing down to his star and the sheaths were bowing down to his sheath, where he was being prophetically given a word from God that he was meant to rule and reign. And so I remember back when I was in high school, I remember that nobody ever said I was going to be in charge of anything. I wasn't a very good student, but I remember that happening. I remember doing this in Spanish class. Every day we go to Spanish class, and I was really bad at Spanish. And so I would sit there, and they would start talking about whatever, how to conjugate verbs, and I would just start to write a list on my paper of all the things I would buy if I won the lottery. And I would like draw like floor plans for my mansion that I would build, and like what kind of yacht I would get. I would just start to make these lists, and I'd like order them and rank them, and like what's the most important, right? Like, it sucks because later on when I went to college, then I had to like retake all that Spanish because I never learned anything because everybody else was in Spanish and I was in lottery list class. But if you were young like that and someone told you you're going to be rich and famous and you didn't have anything and you were poor, the opportunity for that to go to your head and do some weird things is certainly possible. That is likely what happened to David. But nothing changed in his life. Everything was the same as it had always been until one day his father says, I want you to go check on your brothers who are in the military. And we all know the story where David goes to check on his brothers. Right when he gets there, Goliath comes out to the field. They're lined up against the Philistines. Goliath comes out. David says, I'll fight him, goes out and fights him and kills Goliath. One of the greatest stories. You don't have to be a Christian to know the story. Everybody knows the story of David and Goliath. That is the second important event in David's life. What's important about that event for us tonight is what happened actually right after that event. In 1 Samuel 18, verse 6 through 9, it says, it happened as they were coming when David returned from killing the Philistine that the women came out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, with musical instruments. The women sang as they played. Now, these women are coming out to celebrate. There's a war parade, a victory parade. They just got an incredible victory over their enemies, the Philistines. This is a radical turn of events. Everybody's terrified of the Philistines. They had this giant Goliath. He was a man of war. They had no chance against him, and they won. And the women began to sing, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Then Saul became very angry, for the saying displeased him. He said, they've ascribed to David 10,000, but to me they've ascribed only 1,000. But what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. What's interesting is sometimes the best things in our life, the greatest things in our life, the greatest testimonies even, spiritual things, the things that God does can have unintended consequences downstream. They can create real problems for us. They can actually become bad things. Things that you almost might wish, I wish that had never happened, because in fact, that ruined my life. Now, what happened with David is that one of the things that happened with David is that as a reward for killing Goliath, Saul had said, the man who kills Goliath, I will give to marry my daughter. And so Saul gave his daughter Michal it's a girl, Michal to marry David. And so David actually became Saul's son-in-law. And he left his house that day and lived in the house of Saul. When it says the house of Saul, it means just like one of Saul's properties. And Saul made him a commander over a lot of people. But Saul hated him. And Saul said to him, he said, I'll let you marry my daughter Michal if you bring me the foreskins of 100 Philistines. You remember, I don't know if you remember, you definitely don't remember, but you know how sometimes back in Native American warfare, they would take scalps, right? So if they killed you, they would cut off part of your hair, part of your scalp, and they'd carry them around as like war, tokens of victory. All right, well, the Israelites did a little different. Saul said, I want you to bring me 100 foreskins. If you don't know what a foreskin is, don't Google it. Go home and ask your parents. But what he said was, I want you to kill 100 Philistines to marry my daughter, Michal, as a dowry. Now, Saul was saying this because he wanted him. You guys switched it on me. I thought we were at 25 minutes all of a sudden. Yeah, it was counting up before. Now it's counting down. All right, nice try. Okay. David goes and does it. Saul was trying to set him up that it was an impossible task. He's going to get killed trying to do it. But Saul was setting him up. Saul also tried to stab him with a spear, but David was able to get out of the way. Every time after that, Saul made it up. They made up. They were okay again. But at some point, Saul learned that David had been anointed by Samuel to be the next king. And he knew, he could see the writing on the wall. He knew his days were numbered. Saul wanted his son Jonathan to become the next king, but David was. The chapter before the one we're looking at tonight, in chapter 20, David becomes totally clear, 100% clear, that Saul is going to try to kill him. He's sending mercenaries, he's sending soldiers to find David to hunt for him. Jonathan and him set up this elaborate scheme. They meet in this field, and Jonathan tells him, yes, my dad is hunting for you. They're friends. They say goodbye, and David is off. Now he is running for his life. That is going to set up a trial in David's life. I said this is a turning point in David's life. The next 10 years of David's life, he's going to be running as a hunted man, as a fugitive in the wilderness of Israel. Now you think about the turn of events. Going from being anointed as a 12-year-old kid, you're going to be the next king. Probably 16 or 17, he defeats Goliath. And only a year or two later, now, for the next 10 years of his life, he's going to be on the run. Now, I don't know if you ever thought about this. I don't know, anybody in here know, like, a prepper, like somebody who's, like, planning for the apocalypse? They have, like, a bomb shelter in the backyard, or anybody in here, maybe the person you know is you? Anybody, you got any of those in here? Okay. There's something among the prepper community called a bug out bag, right? Or a go bag. This is a bag that you just have packed that if you got to go in the next 10 minutes, you have 10 minutes and you got to leave for whatever reason, you got to go. This is the bag you just grab, and it has all the stuff you could possibly need in it. If you've been paying attention to the situation in Ukraine at all, a couple weeks ago, they would show these videos of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, and it was people going about business, life as normal. They had lived with Russians threatening them for their whole lives. They didn't think it was going to happen. And then Russia actually invaded the Ukraine, and everybody's trying to get out of Kiev, or the big cities. They're trying to get to Poland. They're trying to see everything they can to do to get there. And they have these huge traffic jams. And they couldn't even get out of the city. And people are leaving their cars and walking miles and miles and miles in order to try to get to a safe place. Now, I don't know if you ever thought that, like did that mental experiment. If you just right now, turns out you're in some shady biz and the feds are showing up at your house and you got to go. You just got to leave. Where would you go and what would you do? This is a question I want anybody in here. Where would you go? What would you do? Because we're going to send this information to the feds. Yeah. You would go to the feds. Okay, you're dead meat. You got captured. Easy. Yeah, where would you go? Mexico. Okay. Good choice. We're here in the United States. Mexico's a good choice. We're close to the border. You get over there. Maybe the laws aren't the same. They have to send Dog the Bounty Hunter after you. Yeah. Okay. Go hijack a plane. Get in there. Do you know how to fly? You do? Oh, great. Yeah. Okay. You have that option. The rest of us will be all, where's the gas pedal? Yeah. Yeah. Hawaii. Swimming, boating, flying. How would you get there? Walk. Yeah. Good. Smart. I see. You're definitely going to make it. Yeah. Yeah, it's good. Okay. Anybody else? Yeah. Brianna. Hold on. Shh. I can't hear Brianna. Hold on. I know I heard you. Listen, Alaska, I got you, okay? I'm talking to the girl behind you, though, so I really appreciate it. All right, Brianna, real loud. You go to the bottom of the ocean. In a submarine. You guys got resources I don't really know about. I don't have that kind of stuff. Yeah. No, it's just, you're like a moving mouth right now. I need you guys to be quiet, and then I need you to yell loud. Okay, so near the Great Lakes, in the wilderness by the Great Lakes. All right. Okay, last one. North Carolina. You got like people there? Smart. The feds will be looking there though, but hey, the people, you said North Carolina? The mountain people of North Carolina, they're pretty good at not talking to the feds, keeping their mouths shut, so that you'll probably be okay. Listen, it's not that easy. It's not that easy. Now, it's especially not easy for David because David is a known person. He's probably the most famous person next to Saul in the whole kingdom of Israel. So not only is he got to run, but he's going to be easily recognizable. Everybody everywhere is going to recognize him. So he's got to figure something out. That's where we pick up, that's the background. That's where we pick it up in verse 1. Verse 1, it says, Then David came to Nob to Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech came trembling to meet David and said to him, Why are you alone and no one with you? Now, what you have to understand is lots of us don't understand exactly how the Bible worked, but in this time, or Judaic law. But in Nob, the city of Nob, was the tabernacle. Say tabernacle. The tabernacle was the place where the people went to worship and offer sacrifices. And only the priests were allowed to offer sacrifices. And so the priest, Ahimelech, who's probably the chief priest here, is with the tabernacle in the city of Nob. Now, what we're going to look at tonight is some ways that David really fell short of what we would hope. One of the great things about David, and one of the great things about the Bible, is so many of the Bible is not just a heroic tale about people who never mess up. The Bible is a story. So many of our heroes in the Bible, they have major flaws. And today, we're going to see some ways that David fell short of what God had called him to. But the one thing that David definitely did right in this situation is when he was in trouble, he went to the house of the Lord. When he was in trouble, he went to seek God. Now, we know that the Bible says that David was a man after God's own heart. David's default was that he loved God. His heart was desperate, was hungry for God. And so when he was in trouble, he went to the house of the Lord. That's about the only thing David's going to do right in this situation. Ahimelech the priest sees David coming, and he can tell that David's not in a good place. He can tell that David is stressed out, that David doesn't look good. He's disheveled. He's been hurrying. It's probably at least a day's journey from where he was to coming to the city of Nob. And David is hungry. He's alone, which David would never travel alone. He would have been a person of great importance. He would have had an entourage that came with him, but nobody's with him. And so Ahimelech says, David, where is everybody? Now David has a choice. You know, one of the problems is, so my sister here is going to North Carolina because that's where all our people are. When you're in a bad situation, you want to find people you can trust. You want to find people who are going to tell you the truth, who are going to be on your side. And yet, when David comes to Ahimelech probably was that kind of man. And yet David's going to lie to him. He's not going to tell him the truth. You know, one of the weird things, as we're talking about testing tonight, one of the weird things is when you get in trouble, so many of us, our first instinct is to lie about it. To make up a story about it or tell something different. When a lot of times the truth is going to be so much better. The lie that David is going to tell here is going to have disastrous consequences. David said to Ahimelech said, Why are you alone? Why are you here? David said, The king has commissioned me with a matter and has said to me, Let no one know anything about the matter on which I am sending you and with which I have commissioned you, and I have directed the young men to a certain place. My army's with me. My guys are with me. I told them to go to a certain place. I'm on a mission from the king. It's a secret mission. Shh, don't tell anybody. That's a lie. That's a lie. He's running from his life. The king hasn't sent him anywhere. The king wants to kill him. The problem with what's going to happen here is that Ahimelech is going to help him. David's going to lie to Ahimelech, and Ahimelech is going to help him. And what's going to happen in the next chapter is that Saul is going to come to the city of Nob, and he's going to find out that Ahimelech helped David, and he's going to kill Ahimelech. He's going to kill, in fact, every priest in the city. In fact, he's going to kill every Levite. He's going to kill every person in that city. He's going to lay waste to it. Now, what's interesting here is my bet would be that if David was honest with Ahimelech, Ahimelech still would have helped him. Ahimelech still would have stood by him, still would have done what was right. But because Ahimelech had no idea what he was doing, he was going to be found guilty of treason. It was going to cost him his life in the entire city. Verse 3, David says, "Now, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever can be found." The priest answered David and said, "There is no ordinary bread on hand, but there is the consecrated bread. If only the young men have kept themselves from women." David answered the priest and said to him, "Surely women have been kept from us as previously when I set out in the vessels of the young men." He's lying again, by the way. There are no young men. It's just David. And David probably hasn't kept himself from women. He was a married man. "Though it has been an ordinary journey, how much more than today will the vessels be holy?" So the priest gave him the consecrated bread, for there was no bread but the bread of presence, which was removed from before the Lord in order to put hot bread in its place when it's taken away. Here's just real quick. In the tabernacle, in the holy place, there's the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant, right outside, there were several different things inside of there. There was the lampstands, and there was the altar of incense. And right to the right of it, there was the altar, the golden table that they put the showbread or the bread of presence. And every week, they would bake 12 loaves to represent the 12 tribes, and they'd put them on this table. And then once a week, when right before the Sabbath, they would go in and they'd take the bread out and they replace it with fresh bread. And when they took the bread out, the priests were allowed to eat it, but only the priests were allowed to eat it. The priests had to be from the tribe of Levi. David, we know, is from the tribe of Judah. David was not a priest. Later on, Jesus is actually going to talk about this scenario. He's going to use it to talk about the Sabbath and whatever. But here, David, because he has need, the priest says, you can have it. You can have mercy because your need, the law of love, the law of mercy, supersedes the law that only priests can eat it. And so he gives it to him. Now, what's interesting is we look about the typology of the temple or the tabernacle is later on, Jesus would say, "I am the bread of life." And this bread is representative of who Christ is, of his nature, of being our sustenance. And so in a certain way, as David takes this bread with him and it's going to provide him his nourishment, this same bread is representative of the way that Christ meets our needs and takes care of us. Next, the next need that David has, one is he's hungry and he's got to have something to eat. The next need that he has is he needs something to protect himself. 1 Samuel 21, verse 8, it says, David said to Ahimelech, "Now, is there not a spear or a sword on hand? For I brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's matter was urgent." Then the priest said, "The sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, behold, it is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you would take it for yourself, take it. For there is no other except it here." And David said, "There is none like it. Give it to me." Now, this is really interesting. What are the odds that the sword of Goliath is at the tabernacle when David shows up and needs a sword? Like, what are the chances? What are the odds? The only sword we got is the sword of Goliath whom you killed. And David said, "There's none like it. Give it to me." That's a great sword. Goliath was a great warrior. I'm in a bad spot. I need this help. And so he takes the sword. What's interesting, though, is when David went to fight Goliath, he comes out in the field. Remember Saul doesn't want to let him fight him. "You're just a boy. You can't fight this guy." David finally convinces him into doing it, letting him do it. He tries on Saul's armor. The armor won't even fit. He can't move. He's too weak to move fluidly with the armor, and so he just goes out in his shepherd's uniform. And when this boy comes into the field, Goliath starts to laugh and starts to mock him. And he begins to show disdain for him. But in verse 45, 1 Samuel 17, then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. And I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds in the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Isn't that interesting? The Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's. But here we have David a couple years later who's like, do you got a sword? Is there a sword anywhere in here? You know, it's interesting that there's a spiritual, God is providing for David, but David isn't getting it. God says, I know what you need. I know how to take care of you. David comes into the tabernacle and says, do you have anything to eat? The priest doesn't have any food except for the bread of presence. And so he feeds him from God's bread. He says, do you have any sword, any weapons? Only one. The sword of the giant who you slew. And what God is saying to him is, do you remember when you fought Goliath? Do you remember how I delivered you? You remember how nobody thought you had any chance? But you knew by faith that I provide for you. That sword is here. And what David thinks is great. That's a great sword. And God is saying, I want you to trust me to meet your needs. I'm going to provide for you. God's at work even when you can't see it. David didn't get it that day. I think later on, David, as he reflected back on this, he thought, man, God, you are so good to me. You know how to take care of me. You know how to meet my needs. But in this moment, he missed it. I want to talk about testing. There's times in your life when you're going to be tested by God. I doubt that some kind of tyrannical, treasonous, murderous king is ever going to try to hunt you and kill you. I hope that doesn't happen. I think it's probably likely you'll live your whole life and won't have to worry about that. But you are going to be tested by some stuff. You are going to have hard things happen. You know, tests come in kind of two ways. Tests can come in long, drawn-out processes, and tests can come when you have immediate circumstances. Immediate moments when there's an emergency or there's a right now moment that you are being tested by God. You know, so often we want to study for tests. I taught for a while. I taught actually at Foothills High School. And, one of the things that a lot of times, when you have a test, you have a midterm and a final, let's say, and students will know, you give them a study guide and they'll say, these are the things I want to study hard, take the test, and then 2 hours after the test, if you ask them to remember anything that was on the test, it's gone. It's like you never knew it. You just held it in your brain just long enough, and then once you didn't need it anymore, you don't remember that. You have no idea. You could not pass your 7th grade history class test right now, right? Because you don't remember that stuff anymore. It's gone now. Well, what we don't like is pop quizzes. Tests where you show up and it's just, hey, test today. But pop quizzes so often are better because what your teacher's trying to find out is, are you learning this stuff? You didn't get to stay up the night before or write the answers out on your hands or study just are you learning this thing? And sometimes God just pop quizzes us. And he's pop quizzing David here, but sometimes he's going to pop quiz you. And it might come in the form of pain. It might come where your boyfriend or girlfriend cheats on you. It might come when your parents sit you down and they say, we're getting divorced. It might come when you get in a car accident. It might come when someone you love dies. It might come when some kind of mental health issue comes on, you just find yourself depressed, broken, really sad, suicidal. It might happen when you get betrayed or falsely accused. It might happen when someone, for whatever reason, they just hate your guts and it feels like they want to destroy your life. These tests come into our lives, and what you do when that test comes is really important. And here's what's important. You don't get to pick how the test comes. You don't get to pick in what form the test is going to be. You don't get to say, look, I'm better at fill in the blank than I am at essays. I like multiple choice with like 2 options. You don't get to pick. You don't get to pick. God picks the way you get tested. And you don't get to pick when you're going to be tested. You don't get to pick, okay, God, I want to be tested after a long night's sleep and I'm well rested and I've had a good breakfast and I'm ready to go. Sometimes you don't get to pick when. It just happens. And you're presented with it. James 1, 2 through 4 says, consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials. All kinds of different trials. A myriad of different kinds of trials. Knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. What that means is when trials come, your faith is being tested. The testing of your faith produces endurance. Let endurance have its perfect result, so you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. God's desire is that we would walk by faith every moment of every day. Luke 9:23, Jesus says, daily take up your cross and follow me. The process of the Christian life is a daily exercise. It is daily walking with God. We don't like that. We have moments of faith. In fact, sometimes when you're walking with the Lord and you feel like, okay, I want to have enough faith right now for the rest of my life. You know it doesn't work like that? You know, if you are a legit, serious Christian, if you walk with God, and God grants you a long life, and you wake up on your 80th birthday, do you know that day when you wake up, you're going to have to walk by faith? It's not just going to be like, oh, no problem. It's going to be uncomfortable. At 80 years old, it's going to be uncomfortable. Faith is always uncomfortable. Faith is always challenging. You learn a lot along the way. You learn how to understand God. You learn how to recognize Him. But it's still a challenge. When God's people were wandering in the wilderness, and remember God, they had nothing to eat, and God made it, every morning they wake up, there'd be bread on the ground, or there'd be manna on the ground. Manna means what is it? They don't even know what it is, but there'd be this stuff, right? I don't know if you remember this, but if you tried to gather up a bunch of it, so you, like, let's say you just said, okay, I want to get all the manna today so that I don't have to worry about it next week, so I'm gonna get like a week's worth of manna. Does anybody know what would happen? It would rot. That's right. Did you just mouth that, or did you actually? Yeah, it's good. I'm a good mouth reader. It would rot. You could only get manna for enough for one day. You couldn't get it for longer than that. You had to trust that tomorrow when I wake up, the manna's going to be there. But dude, you look around. We're in the desert. There's nothing to eat. What if God doesn't show up? What if God forgets? What if God decides He doesn't want to do the manna thing anymore? You know what the deal was? He's teaching you. You have to trust God. That's the only way. The Bible says, apart from faith, it's impossible to please God. The only way to please Him is through faith. And He wants you every day to wake up and to trust Him and to walk with Him. And so when you go through hard times, when you go through difficult things, God wants you that day. He wants you to walk by faith. He wants you to trust Him. You know what's crazy about this is David has already passed so many crazy tests. The lion and the bear, when he was out in the wilderness, the writing of Psalms, he drew close to God in boredom, in mundane. He was the one who stood up to the giant. He followed Him. He's the one who went and killed those 100 Philistines. He had already trusted God and walked with Him. And now, in this moment, he fails. Now, he's not going to fail permanently. In fact, he's going to come out of this. Overall, there's going to be a good experience this time in his life, but in the beginning, he fails. Sometimes we think, oh, I've already done that. I'm already a legit Christian. I don't have to worry about it anymore. That's not true. That's not true. You're going to be confronted. And listen, I want to say something to you. This is so important because it's been a while since I've been in a high school group. I was sitting in the back doing worship, and I was just thinking as some girl walked back, and in the corner of my eye, she looked like this girl who used to come here. And it just made me think back of dude, there's so many people who used to come here. And I'm talking about over the last 20 years used to come here. And so many of them are not walking with the Lord. So many of them, if you had asked them when they were 16 years old, do you love Jesus? They would have said, yes, absolutely, with my whole heart. And you said, are you a Christian? Tell me how you got saved. They would have told you their testimony. They would have talked about how God transformed their lives and how he met them and how he filled them with his Spirit. And today, they don't want nothing to do with God. They're embarrassed of their life when they're grown up. And I want to tell you something, that you're going to encounter some tests over the next few years. You're going to encounter some tests at 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 that are going to challenge how you live your life. I read this essay by this girl who used to go here, one of my favorite kids, whoever grew up in our youth ministry, about how she's deconverted from Christianity. And it's been obvious for a long time, but she just wrote about how, like when she was trapped in this bubble and everybody thought the same, and how she tried to think that way too, but she just couldn't. She just couldn't be honest with herself. And now she's liberated and she's a free thinker. She failed the test. She failed the test. Would she stay faithful to her one true love? I don't know all the details, all the circumstances of her life, but there's so many stories that are just like that, because sometimes we're not ready when the test comes. Sometimes we think, oh, I'm doing fine because I've already passed a lot of tests. And I want to tell you that you need faith today to pass the test today. The last thing I just want to say real quick is one of the things that one of the things I tell people all the time is when you encounter, I'm going to invite the band up here. When you encounter an emergency or a test, it's a moment you need to be really careful. One of the things I always tell people is when someone sins against you, okay? Airplane guy? What's your name? Ian. If I walk up to Ian and I slap Ian across the face, yeah? Weirdo? What's your name? If I walk up to Ethan and I slap Ethan across the face, yeah, okay, yeah, Ian likes that one now. Okay, good. All right, so I walk up to Ethan, I slap Ethan across the face. Ethan now has some choices, okay? Ethan has a choice, right? He can cry. He can call the cops. He can slap me back. Ian and I can then fight. He could cuss me out. He could sue me. He could say, I'm never coming back to this church again. Last time I went to church, a pastor literally slapped me in the face. Forget that. I'm out on church, okay? Ethan could do that. Now, here's the deal. Ethan doesn't get to choose, really, if I walk up to him and slap him in the face. But if I do that, if I sin against him, he did nothing wrong, except for he was kind of mean to Ian. But Ethan, other than that, he did nothing wrong. Of no fault of his own, someone sins against him. Now he's faced with a choice that he didn't have a minute ago. And he needs to be very careful about what he chooses next. Because the choices he chooses next could change his whole life. And here's what I want to tell you. Some people I've seen that have made a shipwreck of their life. It's because in a moment when they were a victim, when through no fault of their own, someone sinned against them, someone sinned grievously against them. It now opened up an opportunity or a temptation for them to choose something that was wicked, for them to sin against God, for them to do something that they knew was wrong, for them to violate their own conscience, for them to do something that they knew God wouldn't have for them. And we're tested, that's the test. How are you going to respond? And so I've had people come to me and say, my husband has cheated on me. He's had an affair and I just found out about it. You know what I always tell him? I always tell him, be really careful right now. Be really careful right now because you are being tested. I just found out that my friend stole all of my money. We were in a company together, and they embezzled all of it. Okay, we're going to talk about everything, but listen, before I say anything else, let me tell you, be very careful right now. You are being tested by God. And so when you're tested, one of the things you need to do is you need to be smart enough to say, okay, hold on. I need to do what's right here. I don't want to fail this test. Sometimes that means I need to go to somebody I trust who's not in the midst of this emotional roller coaster and say, dude, help me understand, help me know what the right thing to do here is. Sometimes it's just a turn to God, fall on your knees and say, God, help me. I don't want to wrong you. I don't want to fail you now. Lord, help me. God brings tests in our life in order to establish us. Remember what it said. James 1, 2 through 4. Consider it all joy, my brothers, when you encounter various trials. Stand to your feet. Quietly. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be complete, lacking in nothing. The promise that God had made to David when he was a boy at 12 years old, I'm going to make you king over Israel. This is all part of that process. This decade of terrible difficulty that he's going to go through is part of God establishing him, establishing the kind of heart that a king needs to have, making him perfect, lacking in nothing, establishing his faith. My heart tonight was one, I just want to put that in your mind, and I wanted you guys to because so often we don't think about testing, or we're cavalier about it, or flippant or something. But I also, as I was just praying about this, I just felt like there's some people in here who are being tested right now. You're going through something, and maybe you didn't even know it, but as you think about your life right now, you can think, I think God's testing me. I just want to pray for you guys tonight. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to have everybody who wants to come forward for worship. We're going to worship. But if you want to go to the back, there will be adults back there. And if you just feel like, I think I'm going through a testing period in my life right now, we want to pray with you. We're going to ask God's Spirit to help you, to strengthen you, and that God would be with you. So if that's you, as we begin to worship, I invite you to go to the back and find one of the adult leaders on the ministry team. They would love to pray for you. Everybody else, let's worship the Lord.